Hello and welcome to an interview in history. This week we'll be talking with upholsterer and seamstress Elizabeth Griscom, also known as Betsy Ross. In history, she's known to be the person who made the second official U.S. flag, also known as the Betsy Ross flag. This interview takes place in August of 1835. Welcome, Mrs. Ross, and thank you so much for taking time to speak with us today. To begin, could you tell us a little about your early life and your family?
Of course. I'm not as healthy as I once was, and I don't see very well anymore, but I'm happy to answer any questions. I was born Elizabeth Griscom on January 1st, 1752, here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I came from a large family. My father, Samuel Griscom, and my mother, Rebecca James Griscom, raised 17 children. Can you imagine that? 17. Only 9 survived childhood. I was the 8th child. I had a sister, Sarah, and a brother, William, that died before I was born. Another sister, Sarah Griscom Donaldson, was named after the earlier deceased Sarah. I was just 5 years old when my sister Martha died, and another sister, Anne, only lived to the age of 2. Brothers Samuel I and Samuel II both died at the age 3. 2 others, twins, brother Joseph and sister Abigail, died in one of the frequent smallpox epidemics in the autumn of 1762. Despite all that, our household was lively and full of work, as you can imagine. My parents were devout Quakers, and they instilled in us strong values of faith, hard work, and community.
That must have been quite the upbringing. Were you close to your siblings?
Oh yes, very much so. My sisters and I helped our mother manage the house and take care of the younger children. Growing up in a family like ours, we all had our roles to play. My brothers, of course, worked with my father. I grew up in a household where the plain dress and strict discipline of the Quakers dominated. Quakers practiced a simple lifestyle and held strong beliefs in pacifism, equality, and inner spirituality. They rejected ostentatious displays of wealth or status and valued community, humility, and peaceful living. I was raised with these values, attending Quaker meetings and receiving an education centered on both religious teachings and practical skills. The Quaker faith influenced many aspects of my early life, including my strong work ethic, focus on craftsmanship, and commitment to community service. I learned to sew from a great aunt, Sarah Elizabeth Ann Griscom. We were a tight-knit family, though we didn't always see eye to eye, especially after the war began. Some of my family remained loyal to the Quaker tradition of nonviolence, while I took a different path.
That brings us to your involvement in the Revolutionary War. But before we get there, could you share a bit about your marriage and children?
Yes, well, I've had my share of heartbreak. I married John Ross in 1773. We met while I was apprenticing as an upholsterer, and we opened our own shop together in Philadelphia. He was not a Quaker, which caused a bit of tension with my family. You see, marrying outside of the faith led to my expulsion from the Quaker meeting house.
So then, because you were no longer part of the Quaker religion, you became part of the Free Quakers. Can you tell us about that?
Of course, during the Revolutionary War, I became involved with the Free Quakers, which is a group that broke away from the mainstream Quakers because they supported the American Revolution. Unlike traditional Quakers who opposed all forms of violence and war, the Free Quakers believed it was acceptable to fight for independence. My involvement with this group showed that while I maintained some ties to my Quaker roots, I also believed in the cause of the American freedom.
Let's get back to your husband, John.
John and I loved each other deeply, but our time together was brief. Sadly, John was killed in 1776 during the early days of the war, possibly while guarding ammunition. I was left to run the upholstery business alone. After John's death, I remarried twice, first to Joseph Ashburn, a sailor who was captured and died in a British prison, and then to John Claypool, a fellow patriot. John Claypool and I had 5 daughters, and thankfully, we were able to raise them in a more stable time after the war ended.
I'm sorry to hear about your losses, but your resilience is inspiring. Let's talk about your role during the Revolutionary War. How did you become involved in creating the American flag?
Ah, the flag. It's quite the tale, and one I'm proud to tell. In 1776, I was approached by George Washington, Robert Morris, and my late husband's uncle, George Ross. They knew me from my work as an upholsterer and asked if I could help design and sew a flag for the new nation. It was a humbling task, and I was honored. They had a rough idea of what they wanted: a flag with 13 red and white stripes and a circle of 13 stars to represent the colonies. I suggested a 5-point star instead of a 6-pointed one, as it was easier to make. They agreed, and I set to work in my shop.
What an incredible moment in history. How did you feel knowing your work would become so iconic?
At the time, I didn't realize how important the flag would become. I was simply doing my job as a seamstress. But now, looking back, I'm proud to have contributed in some small ways to the birth of our nation. The flag became a symbol of unity and freedom, and I like to think my work played a part in that.
Did you remain active in the revolutionary cause after that?
Oh, I did what I could. Times were hard, especially here in Philadelphia, which was occupied by the British for part of the war. I continued my upholstery work, and I sewed uniforms, blankets, and other supplies for the Continental Army. It was my way of supporting the cause, even if I wasn't out on the battlefield.
You've lived through such an eventful period. What do you hope people will remember about your contributions?
I hope they remember the spirit of that time. The courage it took for so many to break away from Britain and build something new. I was just one woman sewing in my little shop, but each of us, in our own way, helped build this country. Whether it was fighting, sewing, or simply raising children with hope for a better future, we all played our part.
Mrs. Ross, let's go back a bit. You've mentioned your work as an upholsterer. Could you tell us more about your profession and how it influenced your life?
Absolutely. My work as an upholsterer has been a constant throughout my life. I learned the craft as an apprentice when I was still a young woman. In those days, upholstery wasn't just about making cushions or pillows. It was a skillful trade that involved creating and repairing everything from curtains and bed hangings to chair coverings. I learned to work with a variety of fabrics and materials, and I developed a reputation for being meticulous and efficient.
It sounds like you were a very skilled craftswoman. How did you come to open your own shop?
After I finished my apprenticeship, John Ross and I decided to open up our own upholstery business here in Philadelphia. It was an exciting venture. We worked side by side, managing orders and producing goods for households all around the city. We made everything from bed linens to furniture coverings and sometimes even sails for ships. Upholstery wasn't just a simple trade, it required precision and a good eye for design. When John passed away, I was left to run the shop on my own. It wasn't easy, but I knew that I had to keep the business going. My work not only provided for me, but also contributed to the community. Even after remarrying, I continued running the shop. I was responsible for making and repairing items for both civilian customers and, during the war, for the Continental Army.
That must have been challenging, especially with the Revolutionary War happening. Did the war affect your business?
Oh, definitely. When Philadelphia was occupied by the British, business slowed considerably. Many families fled the city, and supplies were scarce. But I took whatever work I could get. I sewed uniforms for soldiers, made blankets, and repaired tents. It was my way of helping the war effort. Even when the economy was struggling, I never stopped working.
And, of course, your most famous work came during the war. When you were asked to sew the first American flag, how did your skills as an upholsterer help you with that project?
Sewing was second nature to me by then. The skills I had honed over the years in upholstery, cutting fabric precisely, stitching durable seams, and working with different materials were essential in creating that flag. It wasn't just a simple task of putting stars and stripes together. It had to be done carefully and made to last.
It's fascinating how your work evolved over time. Did you continue your upholstery business after the war?
Yes, I did. Life returned to some semblance of normalcy after the war ended, and I kept the shop going. Upholstery remained my livelihood, and I continued to provide for my family through the business. I also took on other sewing projects, and here they are, making flags for ships and various organizations, for instance. By then, people had to come to know me as the woman who made the first flag, so that led to more work. But at its core, my work was always about serving the community, whether I was upholstering furniture for a neighbor or sewing a flag that would one day symbolize our nation's independence.
I know you have to go, but thank you so much, Mrs. Ross, for sharing your story with us today. Your legacy and the legacy of the flag you created will live on forever.
Thank you. It has been my pleasure.
Betsy Ross died on January 30th, 1836, at the age of 84. In her later years, she suffered from deteriorating health, including blindness, which had a significant impact on her daily life and work. Betsy spent her final years living with her daughter Susanna in Philadelphia. She was buried in the Free Quaker burial ground, after being disowned by the Quakers for marrying outside the faith. Ross's body was first interred at the burial grounds on North Fifth Street in Philadelphia. In 1856, the remains of Ross and her third husband, John Claypool, were moved from the Free Quaker burying ground to Mount Moriah Cemetery. The practice of cemeteries purchasing the remains of famous historical individuals was common in order to drive additional business. The Daughters of the American Revolution erected a flagpole at the site of her grave in her memory. In 1975, in preparation for the American Bicentennial, city leaders ordered the remains moved to the courtyard of the Betsy Ross house. However, cemetery workers found no remains beneath her tombstone. Bones found elsewhere in the family plot were deemed to be hers and were reinterred in the current grave visited by tourists at the Betsy Ross house. And now another forgotten history. In the late 1800s, Ellen Elgin revolutionized the chore of laundry with the invention of the clothes wringer and, in the process, made her mark on African American and women's history. Born in 1849 in Washington, D.C., little is known about Elgin's early life. As a young adult, she worked as a clerk at the local census office and also spent time as a domestic. As a housekeeper, Eglin passed many hours engaged in back-breaking laundry work. The task of scrubbing clothes by hand on a washboard and then wringing out the water eventually sparked Elgin's desire to improve the laundry process, and her idea for the clothes wringer was born. In 1888, Eglin completed her groundbreaking device. The clothes wringer was a device that had two wooden rollers attached to a crank. After being washed and rinsed, wet clothes were fed between these rollers, and excess water was squeezed out. The clothes were then hung to dry, a process which took significantly less time thanks to the wringer. Although the design was hugely popular well into the 20th century, Eglin received almost no credit and none of the financial success of her own invention. At the time when few female inventors could claim rights to their inventions, Eglin's race further complicated her success. In an interview with an 1891 magazine that highlighted female inventors, Eglin said, "You know, I am black, and if it was known that a Negro woman patented the invention, white ladies would not buy the wringer." Eglin's knowledge that racial bias would prevent the wringer's success caused her to sell the design to an unknown white agent for only $18. By 1900, Eglin's invention found a home with the American Wringer Company. The company grew rich from profits earned from Eglin's invention. Eglin's creative problem-solving did not stop with the wringer. She told the magazine, that she was in the process of creating another invention and planned to patent it in her own name so that her identity as a black female inventor would be known. Part of Eglyn's plan, including presenting her new design at the Women's International Industrial Inventors Congress, where everyone was invited regardless of race. Unfortunately, Eglyn never appeared, and the mystery invention was never documented. Little is known about the end of Ellen Eglyn's life, including the place or date of her death. While the limited documentation of her life leaves minimal knowledge about the inventor herself, her clothes ringer was widely popular and well into the 20th century. Join us next week as we change up and interview in history a bit. From time to time, we'll be interviewing famous historical, mythological, and legendary characters. Our first interview will be Robin of Locksley, better known as Robin Hood, known for his efforts to rob from the rich and give to the poor. Should be a lot of fun. Until then, take care.